Alex Dehgan, friend of Dr. Brute, and really happy actually to have you guys here. Particularly our teams have come from many different places around the United States. And this event, I think, is, for me, really the epitome of optimism, right? As we talked about. It is the optimism that is represented in what you guys are, which is the future of conservation, which is the ability to transform the solution sets we have available to us, which is the ability, I think, to solve things in fundamental different ways. We're really lucky to have some amazing conservationists, some people who I've actually learned from, as a conservation biologist myself, have had the ability to work with, and they're going to be pitching you some incredible challenges, which you guys got, some of the teams got a little bit earlier in advance of the conference, but really to understand and have the chance to understand really the nuances of the problems and the nuances of the solutions that we have. But first, to give you more information on this, to tell you some details, I want to introduce Dr. Barbara Martinez, who is another person that actually worked with me 17 years ago in the, sorry about the date, but in the jungles of Madagascar, who herself went on to do a PhD in lemur biology and conservation. So please welcome Barbara. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for coming. So we have 16 multidisciplinary teams from around the country participating in Make for the Planet. And they're all here in this room, but there are also a few of you many of you from the Earth Optimism Summit, and we welcome you. We welcome you to act as mentors, to act as curious bystanders. Come around, see what they're doing, ask them questions, and interact with the teams. And likewise, teams, interact with the people who are here at Earth Optimism and take advantage of all the knowledge that we have around us. So we're going to have, like Alex said, we're going to have 5 challenges presented by the experts today. The teams had about 2 weeks to think about these challenges and to brainstorm, and maybe they've come up with solutions, maybe they haven't yet, but they're going to spend the next 48 hours or so working on those solutions in our pop-up makerspace over in the Innovation Commons. If you haven't been there yet, it's the round area with the really odd acoustics. Go and visit, see the team, see the equipment. We have a few 3D printers running. Like I said, ask them questions and interact with everyone. The teams are going to complete their solutions by Sunday morning at 8:30, from about 8:30 to 10:45. Their solutions will be on display in that same area in a science fair setup. And everyone is welcome to come by. There will be 10 judges roaming about, and we'll select, I'm not a judge. The 10 judges will select 4 of the top teams from the 16 teams. Those 4 teams will then present their solutions in really short pitches on the plenary stage Sunday afternoon. If you saw Alex speak earlier with Dr. Brute, the spy orangutan, he said it was like a Shark Tank, but think friendly Shark Tank, right? Like, this is a whale Shark Tank. All right. And so we hope that you can join us for that too. The judges on that stage will select two finalists who will receive cash prizes and really awesome 3D printed trophies, which are being printed now, I believe. But I also want to talk about how there's life after the Make-a-thon. So this is a short event. We're asking for people to come up with technology, or maybe they're not technology solutions to some of our greatest conservation challenges. But then we don't want you to just go home and throw these things on the shelf and forget about it. We want you to continue iterating on your ideas. We want to inspire creation. We want to inspire collaboration. So we are going to be creating a digital makerspace where you can share your ideas, collaborate, find partners from other disciplines. A lot of the participants are from the engineering field. We have some designers. We have architects. Are there artists? I believe there's someone who's a theater major, too. They're from all different disciplines. And this is what we really need in conservation. We really need to draw from outside of our expertise to help us get to the solutions. All right. Before I introduce our first speaker, I also want to thank our sponsors, because this would not have been possible without support from the Moore Foundation, the Richard Lounsbury Foundation, Schmidt Marine Technology Partners, and then our other partners who have helped us for a very long time, WWF, the Nation of Makers, Hack DC. They're helping us with the 3D printers out there. You can visit them. They're a local hack space in DC. Also, of course, I can't forget the Smithsonian Institute and the Earth Optimism for hosting us here. And there are a number of participants in Make for the Planet from Arizona State University and Duke University. We also have other universities, and we also have non-students participating. We have a great diversity of participants. But I also just want to thank those two universities in particular, because they're actually providing some support for their students to be here. Okay, so with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Katie Matthews is the Deputy Chief Scientist at Oceana, and she is going to present our first challenge: maximizing food, minimizing catch, tackling overfishing, wastage, and market inefficiencies in our seafood systems.
Hi, folks.
Oh, and
Should I just use that one? Okay. I'm like afraid to touch anything for fear of, making it all go terrible again. Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Matthews. Like Barbara said, I'm the Deputy Chief Scientist for an international marine nonprofit called Oceana. We work in 7 countries plus the EU, primarily on sustainable fishing and protecting ocean biodiversity and habitats. So this is the first time I've ever pitched anything. This is new for me too, so bear with me. We have a particular challenge in our wild-caught fisheries. I guess, how many of you eat fish? Okay, all right, so we got fish eaters here. All right, that's good. So you probably don't think about where your fish come from very often. And frankly, in the United States, most of the people that eat fish eat shrimp and salmon and tuna. Those are sort of the popular ones. But in most of the rest of the countries, you're a small coastal fisherman, and this is about 90% of fishermen around the world. You catch what's near you, you sell it locally, and if you aren't able to sell your fish, then you might not eat tonight. You might not have food, you might not have money. So some of the things that we work on is trying to restore ocean abundance so that people have food and livelihoods and healthy, productive fisheries. So anyways, I will get started. So nearly 1 billion people around the world woke up hungry this morning. Population is growing. We need to produce more food. And wild fish are a potential source of protein that we've not necessarily managed particularly well, and there's places where we can do better. And if we rebuild fisheries, there's additional food out there in the water. And one of the things that we work on is improving fisheries management so that we can get there. And my challenge is, how do we recapture that lost fish? So this is fish that either should be in the water but isn't, because the stock, the population of the fish, is lower than it should be, so it's not as productive. This is lost fish because you haven't been able to store it well, or lost fish because you haven't been able to get it to market in a way that is efficient. So I promise this is the only graph that I'm going to show, and it's because I felt like I should do some justice to attempting to explain what overfishing is, and I'm putting lost fish in quotes because these are fish that didn't necessarily exist to begin with, but because of depleted fish populations, you have kind of empty oceans, right? So this curve that you see over here illustrates the fact that the more you fish, the harder you fish, you get more food, right? But only to a certain point. And then at a certain point, you can continue to fish harder and harder and harder, but there's just not any fish left in the ocean, right? So there's something called maximum sustainable yield. It's MSY. It's that top of that curve there. And the notion is that with proper fisheries management, you can identify how much fish should be in the water and what your maximum sustainable yield is. And to do that, you need information. You need to know how much fish is coming out of the water from the fishermen. You need to know how many boats are out there looking for the fish, how hard they have to fish. And if you don't have that kind of information, you don't know how much fish is left in the ocean. And then you can't make predictions about how much you should go out and catch next year, that sort of thing. So without that kind of information, you can't figure out where you are on this curve. And if you don't know where you are on the curve, then you might be overfishing and depleting your stocks, and then there's no adults to have fish babies next year. So that's one of the challenges, is that in most countries, we don't have the information that we need to manage fisheries well. Waste. So even after you catch the fish, about a third of it is lost to spoilage in some way. And that could be straight up like the fish is rotten, you can't sell it. It could be that the quality of the fish gets bad. It's been in the bottom of a hold. It's all like mashed up. Nobody wants to buy your like ugly, mushy fish with like a missing tail. And you don't get as much money for that fish as you would have if you had had a proper nice fish. Like nobody wants to buy the ugly fish at the market. They always pick the nice looking fish. And you can also lose nutrient quality if you have a poorly stored fish. So that's a third of fish. It's kind of like, it's unsexy. It's like, energy efficiency isn't like the sexy thing when people are thinking about how they're going to reduce carbon emissions. But this is sort of the energy efficiency of fisheries. We can be more efficient with the fish that we catch. But again, you're talking about 90% of the world's fishers don't necessarily have access to the technology, the infrastructure, the resources to properly store their fish in a way that means they can sell it later and it's nice, nice, healthy looking fish. So inefficiencies. Another problem that happens is like wild caught fish, like they got ups and downs, and you can get seasonal scarcity, you can get gluts, and so you have this fluctuating pattern of fish coming in. You might catch a whole bunch of one kind of fish, but it turns out that's not what the market needs, and so you don't get very much money for your fish, and then you're sad, and you have to go back out and catch even more fish because you need to make money somewhere because you've got to pay a mortgage on your boat, and you kind of continue this cycle of catching maybe not the right thing or too much of one thing, and then not being able to sell it for as much as you want, and then having to go back and catch even more fish because that's the only way you're going to put food on your table. So one of the other problems is, kind of gets back to the storage part, if you don't have a good way to store your fish for later, you can't like ride out a glut, right? And so then that means you kind of have to sell your fish in the moment, even if that's not the optimum time to do it. And there's a few folks that have been working in individual locations with particular sort of fleets and markets to try to find out ways to smooth out these big fluctuations so that fishermen can have a more reliable source of income and they're not hammering fisheries when they're down because, oh my God, I really need some food right now. So mismanagement, waste, and inefficiency. So like I said, there's some solutions that are already in development or in play, though none of these are particularly scaled very well, so they're getting done in individual locations. So one instance is there are programs where recreational fishermen in particular, they're hard to get information from. Like I said, you need to know how much fish is coming out of the water so you can manage it well. So they can use their mobile phones to say how much fish they caught, and they send a text in. Now that works really well in some developed countries where people have like real nifty smartphones and they have like apps and it's very cool. In a lot of other countries, they don't have smartphones, but in one fishery in Malaysia, they set up just SMS text messaging, where if you sent in how much fish you caught that day, then you got free weather reports from the weather agency in Malaysia. And then that was nice because they got a little something for the information that they were getting back. And then the Malaysian Fishing Authority was able to get some information on how much fish was coming out of its waters that it could use for management. So that's a little bit more of a lower tech version. Storage solutions, cold storage, smoking, salting, drying, anything that you can do to hold on to fish when there's a glut, store it for yourself, store it for later when you can get a better price for it. It's kind of hard to access those technologies. They tend to be expensive or not really scalable. But that's something that folks are working on. And then Smart Fish, which is a program in Mexico, the one that I mentioned, where they're trying to connect fishers and businessmen so that there's a way to put the fish where it needs to go, where you can get the best price, and then suppliers know what they're going to get, and they can actually go out and make requests to fishermen about what they want and how much they need. So the challenge, how do you recapture this? Lost fish. So whether it's lost because the fishery isn't managed well, it's lost because it was spoiled, or it was lost because it was sold inefficiently at a time when you probably couldn't get the best price or the best quality. And again, those solutions need to be something that most fishermen could take advantage of. And as far as particular details, I was trying to be, this is my first challenge, so I didn't want to be too constraining about what kinds of solutions might exist out there. So this is just what my limited science brain came up with. But I hope that there's other people that are thinking more creatively about how you deal with these issues. Because there have been lots of people like me thinking about this, and not necessarily lots of other kinds of people. And I think the hope is that by asking the question of new faces, you get better answers. So that's it. Questions? I think I'm okay, more or less. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks. What? Oh, yeah, okay.
We have time for a couple questions. Do they need to come to the microphone for the anyone managing that live feed, the camera?
There's a camera.
Bring microphones to you.
Oh boy, hi, I'm Stu. Question for you: what happens to the lost fish and the spoilage thing? Are they throwing that back into the ocean? Or is there a designed market purpose for those things? And if we took advantage of that,
Yeah.
would that encourage more overfishing, or would it manage it in a different way?
Good question. There is kind of, sort of, sometimes a market for that spoiled fish. Often the really nice looking fish go to the folks who can afford it, and the sort of mangled looking gross fish go to the people that can't afford the nicer looking fish. And then the stuff that's really sludge, there's actually a sales category for like the sludge that comes out of the hold at the bottom of boats that usually goes to animal feed, fish feed, even fertilizer. And so there is kind of a market for it, but you don't get very much money for it. Obviously, they would prefer to just sell all beautiful fish. Though the flip side of that is that there are poor people buying the cheaper fish. So if everything's a beautiful fish, then maybe there is a reduced market then for folks that could only afford the kind of mangly fish. So
Probably have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Francesca. I wanted to ask about, I guess, the scope of the challenge, and that in terms of overfishing, you do have the fisher side of it, and then you also have the other half, which is the consumer side, which is all of us. And so I was wondering to what extent you are actually looking for solutions to that, or ways to approach that as a way to then help sustain the livelihoods for fishers.
It's a good question. So there's definitely folks that are working on the consumer side, and from things as sort of straightforward as buying guides, buy this fish, not that fish. But I actually do think it's harder than you think, because you don't always know what you're getting when you're a consumer, and that's like a whole other challenge. In terms of seafood fraud and knowing whether or not what you're getting is actually what you're getting. The other challenge is what I've kind of mentioned earlier, which is that here the majority of the food that we eat, fish that we eat, is like tuna, shrimp, salmon, and other stuff. And most of the fish caught in the world is not, like the challenges are not necessarily with those fishes in this particular challenge. It's coastal fishermen that are operating in communities that, their consumers are, other people in the Philippines, and it's a Filipino fisherman and a Filipino consumer, and those solutions might look different than somebody in the United States. So, all right.
Are you going to stick around? How long are you here today?
I'll be here through the questions at the end of this
Oh,
session.
this was the question we had.
Oh, okay.
Just
So,
each-
all right. Then,
first
yeah,
in the
I don't
session.
know. can stick around a little bit. Oh, I'm getting put on the spot right here. Yes, I'll stick around some.
All right, so we're going to move to, thank you. Thank you. So some of our speakers are going to stick around afterwards for the teams who have more questions. So I'm sorry I put you on the spot, Katie, to ask you if you were one of those. You can email Katie with questions. For those of you on the teams, yeah, I can provide you with her contact information. All right, so our next speaker today is Dr. Peter Limegruber. He is the head of the Conservation Ecology Center at the Smithsonian's National Zoo and Conservation Biology Institute. And his challenge today deals with tracking the movement of small animals in forest ecosystems.
Good morning, everyone. This is super exciting. I'm going to be talking about movement of animals, and there's a lot of technology that's already happened. Oops, a little cut off. The big challenge in conservation biology is to understand where, why, how, and when animals move, and how that's related to biodiversity. And really, if we were able to track every individual animal from its birth to its death, we would gain information right now that we don't have. We would learn about where they're born, what habitats they use, how they have social interactions, where they die, why they die. Those are all things we don't know for most of the species we really care about. If we know that information, we can be much more efficient and effective in our plans for conserving animals. Movement is an incredibly important fact of at least animal life, but probably also plant life. If you don't move, you're dead. So really understanding that is very critical. But it's also, there's a huge value to society for us to better understand why animals move. We can better understand how populations are connected, what we need to do to keep them connected. We can understand how animals spread. Perhaps we can also understand these ecosystem services where animals can spread the seeds of plants, and those things could be extremely important to maintain biodiversity and forest fragments into the future. And it goes on, zoonotic disease. I think you could probably think of other examples yourself. So there's probably a huge value to understanding movement. Alex has already pointed out this morning in the session, this has done more for conservation biology than most technology out there. It has a miniaturized GPS, it has an efficient battery, it has an accelerometer that tells you which way you're oriented, all this kind of technology which has helped us push movement ecology into a completely new field in ecology itself. And so we're tracking lots of animals. There's lots of innovation happening already. You can see on the left the giraffe. Have you ever thought about how you put a collar around the giraffe? Actually, it's not very good for the animal because with the neck, it's very sensitive. So people have tried backpacks and different kinds of things. And the latest development we have is a tiny solar-driven GPS tracker that's attached to the ossicon. Might not work because they fight with their ossicons, the males, but so far it looks like the least invasive design, and the preliminary testing shows they work really, really well because they're always above the vegetation, they always get sun, they could potentially last for years. So we track a lot of stuff. We have all this technology. I'm going to not talk too much about this, but the current push really has to do with the access to relatively small GPS-based, cell phone-based, or satellite phone-based transmitters. So we can track things in really remote places. But there are some very severe limitations in that we can only track big things. But the majority of things that we're really interested in are very small. Bats, migratory birds. There's, I don't know how many thousands migratory birds there are that we don't know the most basic things about. We don't know which breeding population is connected to what wintering population. We don't know where they go, when, how, why. All that stuff is lost to us. So that's on the big scale, but it's also really relevant on the fine scale, where we really want to understand how animals interact in a system. So right now it's all based on individuals. We're tracking a few individuals. That's very cool. People love it. It helps us build empathy for conservation because you can track, I don't know, Dumbo the elephant, whatever you want to call it. People get really excited about it. But ultimately, we would love to track thousands of individuals of multiple species in an entire system and really get this interaction that right now we are completely missing. There are places where this is already starting. It's much easier to do in an open landscape, right? Because most of this is some kind of radio wave that's being transmitted and that you have to receive somewhere. So in an open landscape, you have little distraction, you have little reflection, and you can track it. But if you try to do this in forests, it's really hard. Past solutions for this kind of focused on trying not to track on the ground. So, when you think about a radio signal traveling through the forest, if you travel parallel to the ground, you hit all this vegetation, you kind of drop out right away. But if you go through the canopy, you just have that distance you travel through the vegetation, so you get a much better signal. So you work with towers or airplanes. But there are some really cool solutions that already exist. So the challenge is kind of to develop a system, an ecosystem-based system that will allow tracking of multiple small species in a forest ecosystem. The technology that already exists that this could be built around on or could kind of spin off is there are relatively small transmitters already. There are nano UHF transmitters that are small enough to put on tiny animals. There may be potential with RFIDs, but I think the difficulty there might be range, but that would be really also interesting to explore. So RFIDs, they don't send out a radio signal, and they're passive, so they don't need a battery. They're very simple. They can be very tiny, but you need to have some kind of an active antenna system that sends out a signal that bounces off. There is a system that's worth looking at when you're developing this. It's called Atlas. It was developed by an Israeli group. It's actually in Hua Valley in Israel, and they have these towers, and they're using these VHF signals. And what's very innovative about this is that they have a way that they can almost GPS accuracy from the GPS positions based on how the signals come back. Don't ask me, I'm not a physicist. I don't know how it works. Some people, in very few cases, people are talking about using UAVs to try and find things. I only know of one case, and I don't think it's operational. There are some attempts that people have made. I'm not sure they really represent the optimal kind of approach, or that's really the right strategy to go. So really, what I would love to see is something that is a relatively flexible, field-ready solution that can be used in an environment that has a very dense vegetation, and that could be used to track a lot of animals. So 40 is actually not that many, but I think as an initial challenge, that would be nice. And, we're talking about small animals. I was trying to think about something local, but you can make this sexier by thinking any forest in the world, and you think some tiny mammal. Perhaps it's even possible to do amphibians or reptiles, be even more interesting because we know nothing about their movements. And then a relatively small area, but still, when you start trying to develop a solution, 100 hectares can be really tough, actually. And perhaps if sustaining daily tracking for 4 months, that would be like a breeding season. I think that's a realistic space that could be filled, but it's challenging enough. And it should be fully automated. We don't have 50 people to send out every day and every night. On top of that, many of these environments, you don't want to send someone out at night because it's not optimal if there are tigers around or other things. So, there is a lot that's already available. So this is perhaps the difficulty here. But I think what I would like to see is a group coming up with something that they think could be sustained over a longer period of time, is relatively quickly to do, is relatively inexpensive, and allows this collecting of this type of information. And I'm around the whole meeting. I would love to sit down with you guys. In general, actually, I would love to see a lot more of interactions like this. I've been a conservation biologist for 30 years, and what you find is you're supposed to be a fundraiser, a scientist, an engineer. You can't be all these things. So we need these multidisciplinary approaches where people with technical skills join, with the people that have the social skills or whatever it is. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Back there?
Hello, my name's Peter. One of the things I'm wondering is, what is the sort of, say, spatial and time resolution that you need to kind of learn about these species? So you were saying earlier that that Israeli team figured out how to do this sort of GPS level accuracy, but is that what is needed, or can we say, oh, we know they're in this region, and that's still enough to kind of learn and kind of build new inferences off of?
This is an excellent question, and it's of course a complicated issue. So in terms of spatial accuracy, we would like GPS level accuracy because you really need to pinpoint where this animal is in space. But then the question is, what's your recording frequency? How many positions a day do you need? And that's driven by the basic questions that you're asking. So if you wanted to calculate a home range for an animal, you would want a few positions a day and night over a really long period of time, whereas if you wanted to know what are the activity patterns of this animal during the day, you would want to have 15-minute resolution. So I would look for a medium level. I would say if you can get a position every hour through the day with GPS position accuracy, that would be incredible. If we could track 10 chickadees, 10 chipmunks, 10 for a full field season at 1 hour resolution in that no one has that data set. Yeah, that'd be new.
Okay, great.
Okay, I shouldn't be asking questions because I'm technically a judge, but I just had a question around food chain, which is just, are there food chain issues, right? So you have a small animal, you put a tracker on it, another animal eats it, and now the tracker's in the other animal. So is that something that our team should think about?
I wouldn't worry about that.
Okay.
So from my perspective, that's a mortality event. This is what I was talking about. It's a mortality event. Getting to the point where you track the predator, but the probability of these animals to be eaten is not even that high. But it's a really good question. But my main point here would be to know that an animal died and why it died, and finding the location where it died is something that we usually don't get, and it's very critical information for us.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question. All right. It's Alex, it's you or Chris.
We'll fight it out.
We'll fight it. Can I do this one?
All right.
I think he has a better question.
Peter, I'll give you the next one, Chris. Peter, this is my question to you. What is your mood shot? What seems impossible in the movement space that you want to challenge these teams? You've given us something that seems feasible. What is the toughest animal out there to actually track?
Okay,
where
well,
the information would be completely transformative to their conservation?
if we're talking about small animals, then I don't think anyone has tracked salamanders. I think it would require an RFID solution. So there are people that have tracked salamanders in the ground with RFID, which is very interesting because we don't know where they go in the soil. But they're basically walking with, they have to walk with a detector over the ground. But
All right. Thanks, Peter.
thanks.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Max Wright. He's the remote sensing and spatial modeling analyst in the Moore Center for Science at Conservation International. And his challenge has to do with ecosystem services, the nature we need.
All right, thank you.
Hi everyone, it's great to be here. This is a really cool event, and I'm excited to kind of take you on this journey with me into some of the things we think about a lot at Conservation International. Is how do people benefit from nature, and how can we maintain those benefits into the future? So, at CI what we say is people need nature, and that's kind of like our catchphrase, I guess. But it goes a lot deeper than that. People around the world depend on nature for food, water, climate resilience, well-being, and the benefits that nature provides are particularly important for the most vulnerable populations out there. People in the developing world, indigenous peoples. These are the type of people that use nature every day, interact every day in their life. And without those natures, without those benefits, they'd be seriously impacted. So these benefits are known as ecosystem services. I'm going to talk a little bit about what ecosystem services are in case some people in the room maybe aren't familiar. It's a term that's thrown around a lot, but at the end of the day, it's quite simple and quite relatable. Ecosystem services are all the things that nature provides for us. These can be things like regulating our global climate through carbon cycles. This can be, preventing avalanches or landslides or reducing erosion. It can even be things that are cultural values, like scenic beauty or, spiritually powerful places for people. All these, pollinators. So there's actually another great example that, people so often overlook. A lot of the crops that we depend on are being pollinated by nature. All these benefits are kind of fall within the category of ecosystem services. And this is what what my challenge is going to be based on today, and that's what I'm putting to you. So what are the threats to ecosystem services? That picture doesn't come out very well, but that is a small-scale gold mine in the Suriname jungle. But the greatest threat to ecosystem services is the destruction of natural habitat. That's the natural habitat is essentially the generator of these services. That's where it all comes from. And right now we have this disconnect between people and nature. And this disconnect is what leads to that destructive behavior. People act against their own self-interest because they're no longer connected back with the nature that they need. And as these building blocks continue to erode, we continue destroying nature, then the very functions that our society depends on will start to, or are in jeopardy. I really like this quote. Wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit. And that's Edward Abbey. I like that quote a lot because it reminds us that humans don't exist in parallel to nature. And we don't exist separate from nature. Nature is intrinsically part of who we are. It's kind of where we came from. And in today's world, we've kind of forgotten that in general. Therefore, my challenge to you guys is to fix the connection. The connection between people and nature is broken. The solutions that we're looking for within the ecosystem service space should seek to bring awareness about ecosystem services and then ultimately influence behavior to change the way that humanity interacts with the natural world. They told me to go big for this creative space, so I didn't really think in the parameters or anything like that. I kind of was like, all right, what would be the problem that I really want to see solved in relation to ecosystem services? And this is, I think, a good starting place. But we've also broken that down to kind of 3 themes that you guys can dig into a little bit. And the themes, these are just what I've identified kind of thinking about this problem, and can just be a jumping board for you guys to come up with even more creative stuff. The first theme is all around building awareness. And that's, these solutions should seek to either contribute to the body of knowledge on ecosystem services, push the science, or maybe just disseminate the information better. There's a lot of great science already out there that people just don't know about. That connection's just not being made. The next theme is on changing behavior. These solutions can use the research that's been done in the behavior change field to address problems of ecosystem destruction and the loss of services. It's a really rich space, and especially in things like health and in the social sciences, behavior change research is really, there's a lot of really cool research that's been done there, but a lot of that hasn't been applied into the ecosystem service space, or for educating and getting people to change the way that they interact with ecosystem services. And finally, my last one I've dubbed rewiring the connection. And I thought of this as more of the technology solution space. So solutions should seek to use technology to repair the connection between the human and nature, to ensure that ecosystems and their services will benefit future generations. The idea is, maybe the enemy here is not technology and human development in nature. That's usually the dichotomy that people like to do, is development versus nature. And I think that's a false dichotomy. Really what it is we can use, the disconnect is not, the battle's not development versus nature, it's the people. We have to reconnect ourselves with nature so that we can develop in a way that brings those benefits and those values into our lives. So with that, I will open it up for questions, comments, discussion, and I'll be around after this session if you'd like to follow up on anything. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have time for questions.
I'm sorry, I'm stuck in here. Thank you. A very brief question. You use wilderness and you use nature.
Yes.
They're not the same thing.
They're not.
Are you looking for a wilderness solution or a nature solution?
Nature-based solution, please.
Thank
Or
you.
actually, if you have a wilderness solution, that's good too, but humans interact with wilderness a lot less than they interact with nature.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh,
Hi, I was wondering if there are any current solutions you think are good to look at or give you inspiration.
Yeah, for sure. There are a lot of connecting people with nature. There are a couple solutions in that space as well. Actually, interestingly, I come from a completely different, I'm a remote sensing specialist. So most of the time my work is literally using satellites and looking down on the Earth and looking for big trends and trying to model those patterns so we can make better decisions. But within the ecosystem science, and especially the behavior change space, there's a lot of really interesting work that's been done, especially around visualization, being able to better visualize big data. You know, a lot of this stuff exists, but if you can't digest it, and people who maybe aren't really technically minded aren't going to comb through all that data to figure out the solutions. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on in visualization. I've seen some cool gamification kind of projects to try to get people more involved or more connected or interested in the nature in their own backyards. And then, of course, you know, a lot of the big NGOs we've been trying for a long time to try to keep people engaged in nature. You know, you're always trying to make that push. So kind of open up to you guys to see what you can bring to the table.
Question back here.
Yeah.
What would biophilia fall under in the design and construction aspect? Is this geared towards a solution to your challenge?
Excuse me, you have to repeat that. I'm not familiar with biophilia.
Biophilia, it's like phil means like love, bio means life. So it's like including nature in the urban environment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I really do leave the solution space wide open for you guys. I'd love to see what innovations you can make, and it's intentionally left very broad. But yeah, creating that connection between humans and nature and the urban environment could be another interesting solution space to examine.
Hi, you were mentioning there are a lot of data sets that are already out there that need someone to make them emotionally accessible to people. Are there any in particular that you would point to or that you could share for us to tackle?
Yeah, let's see. So in the U.S., the bison database is, I'm going to go more animals right now because that seems to be the charismatic thing that people latch on to. You have the bison database in the U.S., really highly detailed. If you've dug into the database, kind of dense. You have the IUCN data, which is the red list endangered species stuff, and that's been going on a long time. They do excellent work, and it's really cool stuff. But again, if you're not a spatial scientist, you're probably not playing with those species range data very much or trying to see what patterns come out of it. Those are a few that come off the top of my head. As far as ecosystem service stuff, there's been some very interesting work looking at trying to better model ecosystem services at different scales. Natural Capital Coalition is one group that's done some cool work in that space. I recommend our colleagues at Global Forest Watch if you want to see like a really good example of visualization, a visualization platform that really tries to bring together a lot of information. I think that's a great example to take a look at. Yeah, and I think I've given I could also probably take a quick look and write down a few more for you as well. Yep.
And then we have one more quick question.
Yeah.
So kind of linked to the built urban question earlier. So approaches will differ not only in region, so urban, suburban, rural, but also norms and needs differ between developed and non-developing regions. So are you looking for anything that can apply in any particular region? Are you opening it up? Are you going to constrain it? So like, for example, that regional gold mine, are you looking for something that can be applied in localities like that, or are you just anything goes?
Yeah, I try not to constrain. That's my general rule of thumb. But I think any of those solutions make a lot of sense because, for instance, solutions that are based around people in the developing world, there you're protecting people's livelihoods by connecting people back with nature or showing the value of nature. You're actually you're enhancing human well-being. So there's definitely benefits in the developing world, but also in the developed world, that's another problem in and of itself because those people tend to be even further disconnected from nature, but they're the ones who are consuming it at the most alarming rates. So then you can kind of look at the problem from maybe the developed world perspective and say, okay, in the developed world, we have this connection is even more tenuous between people and nature. How can we strengthen that so that the externalities that the developing world is producing, or they're consuming, I should say, and the effects that they're having on nature are better understood. So I really do want to leave it as open as possible for you to move into either space.
Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker. Okay, good, it's displaying. Our next speaker is Dr. Jamie Reeser. She is the Executive Director of the National Invasive Species Council, and she is going to present today City Limits, Halting the Entry and Spread of Invasive Species. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. By way of background, the National Invasive Species Council was started in 1999. Membership is 13 executive branch secretaries and administrators and the directors of 3 White House offices. We're based here in Washington, D.C. My background's both in biology and psychology, and I'll give you one word for the prior challenge, neurolinguistic programming. Talk to me later. And how do we go forward here? There we go. All right, so invasive species impact every aspect of our national security. Human, plant, and animal health, our food and water availability, also our energy availability, the integrity of critical infrastructure, bridges, dams, buildings, roads, livelihoods and survivorship, particularly in parts of the world where people are highly dependent on local natural resources. They'll also impact military readiness. Imagine an aircraft carrier that has rodent feces in the air vent systems, not able to get up and go on its mission that day. It is the policy of the United States to prevent the introduction, establishment, and spread of invasive species, as well as to eradicate and or control those invasive species that are already established. That statement was published on December 5th of last year in Executive Order 13751. In the United States, environmental damages and associated losses are already amounting to more than $100 billion annually. That's only the environmental impacts. So our challenge and background here, biological invasion is driven by what we would consider 2 components: globalization, that's trade, travel, and transport, and alterations in environmental conditions, habitat degradation, for example, climate change being another. Any organism on the planet has the potential to become invasive if it's moved to another ecosystem. Thus, every species has the potential to be invasive in some locality. These invasive species are not inherently bad. They're not evil. They're not out on a mission to doom humanity. In reality, many of these organisms are vital to the ecosystems in which they are native. And there are some invasive species that are actually rare and endangered in their native habitats. The Burmese python would be one example. The invasive species are a result of a dysfunctional relationship between the organism and the novel ecosystem in which it's found. So here's another way to look at that. She's great, he's great, the house is great. Put them in the same house for a long enough time and, well, there's some organisms that just shouldn't be in the same place at the same time, right? So invasive species inhabit every ecosystem type on the planet: freshwater, marine, terrestrial ecosystems around the world. Islands and freshwater ecosystems are particularly vulnerable to invasive species, in part because the organisms there, in many cases, haven't had the same pressures that species in broader continental systems, terrestrial continental systems, have had. Organisms are moved around the world for a number of reasons. Some of those are intentional. Commercial trade, for example, in food, our pets, things for aesthetics, horticulture for planting, for example, entertainment purposes in some cases. But organisms are also moved unintentionally. They're hitchhikers, they're stowaways, on cargo, on containers, maybe on other organisms that are being intentionally moved. Anything that moves or is moved from one ecosystem to another has the potential to move invasive species along with it, and that includes humans as well. Who's impacted by invasive species? Every single one of us is impacted by invasive species, and you're being impacted in your daily lives in ways that you probably haven't even thought about. Your morning cup of coffee. Coffee borer beetle is taking out coffee plantations in many parts of the world, and into the future your cup of coffee may cost many times what it currently costs. All that time that you and or your parents when you were younger spent weeding, that's time that might have been spent in other more enjoyable ways. the costs that people are spending on doing that weeding, the chemicals that people are using to treat their lawns, the children and pets that are running through those lawns that have been treated. What is the number one threat to baseball? Who can answer that question for me? The all-American pastime is threatened by the emerald ash borer. Baseball, white ash bats, emerald ash borers taking out ash trees. Baseball industry saying, what do we do instead? They've tried using maple splits. It's dangerous at the plate. Our all-American pastime is threatened by a beetle that is this big. Let's go forward here. Whoops. Go back. Okay. Why am I having trouble with these numbers? Okay, so most invasive species come into the United States through ports of entry. And those of you that have the challenge background have a link to where those ports of entry are located. If we can detect and eradicate invasive species in the regions of these ports of entry, they'll never get out into natural systems. They'll never get out into our agricultural systems. But most of the time and attention right now in addressing invasive species is in fact in natural landscapes and agricultural landscapes. It's not in the urban areas. Currently, a very small percentage of the cargo and cargo containers coming into these ports of entry is inspected. I said less than 5%. In reality, it's closer to 1% in terms of what actually gets inspected. And those inspections are what we would call visual inspections. Somebody opens up a container, maybe they'll take out a flashlight, they'll walk around a little bit, maybe they won't even go into it, they'll do this a couple of times, container's closed, and off they go. You've all been through airports, I assume, so you know what that security looks like, people coming back on holidays. Again, very few inspections take place. It's often visual inspections, and it often relies on people to volunteer information about what they might have with them. The identification of these inspected organisms, intercepted organisms, is done through a network of identifiers. Often the best identifier is in some other part of the world that the organism originated in. Finding those identifiers can be very difficult. As many of you know, we're losing our systematics and taxonomy capacities worldwide, so there may not even be a human being on the planet that is an expert in the organisms that have been intercepted. So how do we know how risky that organism is likely to be in the context in which it's entered if we can't even put an identity to that organism? So the challenge, we need innovative approaches for what we call the early detection and rapid response to invasive species, EDRR for short. And we need to apply that urgently in and around ports of entry as a priority area. So we're inviting bold ideas that are, one, cost efficient. You may have heard that government budgets are going to get cut back a little bit in the not too distant future. We need them to be able to be replicated in urban environments across the US so that we can have a standardized process. And we need to take the rate and scope of technology advancement into consideration. And I would say that point is true for all of these challenges today. So we don't want to get stuck with a technology that's going to live in our capacities into the future. We want a flexible capacity that we can build on through time. So here's some areas to think about. Automation. We don't have nearly enough people working at the ports of entry to do the inspections that we would ideally like to do. If we could go from 1% to even 25% of inspections in some way, shape, or form, that would be tremendous in terms of actually protecting this country from the risks associated with biological invasion. Things like artificial intelligence, data analytics, and rapid information sharing, both on the intercept end, but also on the identification and the risk of association of the organisms when they are identified. Think advanced genetic tools such as barcoding that might allow us to actually put an ID on an organism within moments of the interception taking place. And think portable and, again, relatively low cost in order to, I'm usually loud enough, in order to, again, make this as flexible as possible not only for people who are working at the immediate port site, but people that are working in the broader urban environment around the port. Some of these ports do have other mechanisms in place for interception outside the immediate inspection area on the port property, but that's often limited to traps for insects in a certain radius from the port itself. And again, we don't have nearly enough traps and nearly enough people to work those traps, and they're often limited to very specific target species, such as gypsy moths, for example. So think about some of the things that are characteristic of the urban environment to take advantage of. What are the natural, what we would call pitfall traps, for example, in urban environments, where you have window wells, or you have meter boxes? What about the fact that we have security cameras, all over urban environments these days? So what are the take advantage points that are specific to being in an urban landscape? And how might those be brought to bear on early detection and rapid response? Okay.
Yeah, I think we have time for one question.
Hi, my name is Lauren, and I was just wondering, how do these organisms move from the urban ports of entry to the agricultural areas?
It really depends on the organism itself. So you've got some organisms that can just get up and flap and on the way they go. You've got other organisms, let's say ants, for example, that are likely going to get picked up in trains, automobiles, maybe people's personal belongings to move into other landscapes. You've got seeds, again, that might get picked up in treads of a tire, the treads of somebody's shoe. It's pretty organism specific in terms of what the pathways would be, but in a broader sense, think transportation pathways. So trains, cars, probably is the two most significant. A lot of the cargo containers are going to leave the ports of entry on very large trucks. The containers are actually loaded onto a flatbed at the port of entry, and off they go. Some of the ports also have train services going right through them, and the containers get loaded directly onto the trains, and off they go. Yeah, okay.
All right, our final presentation today is by Alex Grabowski. She is a senior program officer at WWF in packaging and material science. I'm sorry, let me get that displayed. Okay, there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Alex, I'm from WWF, and I'm going to talk to you today about the challenge of ocean waste. And before I jump right into it, I wanted to just put it in a little bit of context, which is that we all know that today our resource base is stressed by climate change and a growing population that's really demanding more. And at the same time, we throw away valuable resources every day in the form of waste. And that's, sorry, is that better? All right. So when we do that, we don't just lose the opportunity to reuse those resources, we also are letting them leak into our ecosystems, and that's impacting our wildlife, our livelihoods, and our own health. So plastics are a particular problem when they get into the ocean for the exact same reason as they are valuable materials, because they have special properties. So we need to stop their flow into the ocean. And I'm going to share more about the challenge, and I hope I can inspire you to think about some way to do that. Because if we succeed, we can not only prevent the impacts that we're seeing from these materials when they come into our ecosystems, but we can also literally do more with less if we can capture that value and ultimately demand less from our planet. So to set up the problem, one dump truck of plastic goes into the equivalent of one, goes into the ocean every minute. That's a lot. It's really a lot. And if we do nothing, it's predicted that by 2025, there'll be 1 ton of plastic in the ocean for every 3 tons of fin fish. And that's an unthinkable outcome. That's a lot. This problem is really concentrated in Southeast Asia and China right now. 55 to 60% of the plastic entering the ocean is coming in through the top 5 countries, which are China, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So we already talked about the critical impacts it has. We can go back into more of those later. I want to talk a little bit about the driver. So the main driver is this. All of those places are experiencing really rapid growth, and their population is becoming more affluent and coming out of poverty. And those are all really good things. But the waste management systems in these places have not kept up. And waste management has been identified as the most effective leverage point, intervention point for this problem. It's also the one that can be effective the fastest, and that's really important because time is critical. This chart shows how we dispose of things now. So you can see that in high-income countries, the volume of waste is a lot more. The circle is a lot bigger. But there's not very much of that red and black, right? So that red and black, that's open dump, and then black is no one knows what's happening to it. In a lot of cases, what that means is that it's not collected at all. So if you're looking at the size of the circles, you'll see that although this problem is already critical, the slices that are red and black, although they make up a large portion in the low-income countries and a little bit more in the middle-income countries. Can you guys see the difference between the pink and the red? Okay. This is like light pink. That's landfill. It's different than a dump. This is red. This is red. This is pink. Sorry. It looks much better on my screen. So, basically, the red and the black, which I know that you have trouble seeing, we'll turn the thing around and look at it later, is the stuff that we should be really concerned about for as far as ocean waste goes. All waste has value. Landfill is not a ideal solution, but it does, when you have sanitary landfill, it does contain the waste and usually keep it from leaking into ecosystems. So time is critical because although those circles are small now, they're predicted to go much bigger in the near future. And these numbers are actually from 2012, so they're probably already a little bit bigger than that. The good news is there's so much to gain. Better waste management doesn't just protect habitat and wildlife, it also reduces air pollution because of the fires that break out in open dumps. It protects our freshwater sources as well because it stops leachate from these open dumps from going into the groundwater and surface area or surface water sources. It can actually lower healthcare costs. 2 nations in the Caribbean implemented better waste management systems and actually reduced their healthcare costs between 15 and 25% only 1 year after they did that. It also creates jobs, and it ultimately, if we can capture the value from these materials, we can extend the life of our natural resources and reduce the amount that we're demanding from our planet for primary resources. So what's the challenge? We need to stop the flow of waste into the ocean. And for this, I recommend that you choose a targeted location or context before you decide what kind of solution you want to go after, because it's really different depending on where you are, the exact problem. So I'll give the example of between the Philippines and China. In the Philippines, they have pretty high waste collection rates, and a lot of the leakage that's happening is happening after waste is collected. So illegal dumping by the haulers, people that are actually the waste management services that are picking up the waste and supposed to take it to the dump, that's a problem. Also poorly sited dumps where it's actually very close to the ocean or close to a waterway, and every time there's a storm, it just washes in. And that's kind of the driver that's happening there. Versus in China, it's been identified that most of the leakage is coming from rural areas where there's no collection at all. So you're dealing with a really different situation. Waste isn't aggregated in one place, it's more spread out. And the same kind of solution is not going to work in both those places. So I would say choose a location or choose a context. The context of a city or an island, those have pretty similar kind of, different from each other, but one island might be dealing with the same kind of issues as another island. And we kind of broke this up into 3 focal areas. Recapturing the value embedded in waste. There's a lot of great innovations that could happen there. Mechanisms for stopping pollution and other routes from entering the ocean in the first place. This is, there's a lot of different kind of solutions that could happen there that might not necessarily be technology solutions. It could be a market solution, a financial or incentive solution. And then creating innovations to manage cleanup in places that are already impacted. And so I just want to say about cleanup that cleanup is not going to help ultimately solve this problem for us, but it is still really important because it can help us protect today some places that we feel like are sensitive, important, that need our intervention right now. So a little bit more context. I just want to call out, is this working? Okay, it stopped. All right. I just want to call out a couple of things on this slide. It's really important to think about the needs of the community in the place where you're going to look, because ultimately waste management is dependent on people and it's dependent on their behavior change, and so meeting the needs that they have is going to be really important to long-term success. Inclusive solutions are really important too. This is a picture of people that are engaging in waste picking activities. This is really common in a lot of the target areas, the top 5 countries. This picture is actually from Argentina, but people will sort through waste to find recyclables, things of high value to sell. And so these are often vulnerable populations. They are facing extremely adverse conditions. You can see the open fire just right behind them. And that's the kind of air quality those people are just breathing in every day. So their health and welfare is really important. And finally, the financial feasibility and sustainability of these solutions. A lot of times, especially in developing countries, there's not a lot of money to go around for waste management. And a lot of the more traditional solutions right now, you're looking at infrastructure development, right? And infrastructure development is expensive, and it's expensive upfront. So anything that is able to be a little bit more flexible, more small scale, implemented faster, all great things. Doesn't mean that traditional infrastructure has no role to play, but it is a challenge, the financial feasibility of that. So, any questions? Yeah.
We have time for a couple questions.
I'm curious if you have any data to indicate what the kinds of waste streams tend to be like. What are the sources of those waste streams, or if that data is something that needs to be gathered as well?
Yeah, right. Thank you. We do have some. It is variable from place to place a lot. And so if you look in, here I have actually some resources. So in Stemming the Tide, that's a report that was put together by the Trash Free Seas Alliance, of which WWF is a member. There's some good data for specific places. You can find beach cleanup. A lot of different beach cleanups will have stats on that. But in general, when the kind of first step when you're going to intervene in a place is usually to do a waste characterization study so that you can actually get more specific data. More generally, it's flexibles and things that are harder to collect and are physically have less material in them. So things like pouches, bags, that can be a problem because they aren't as attractive to collect for recycling. So, and that's a function of how waste management works in these target countries right now, is that a lot of times most of the recycling that's being done is being done by individuals who go collect things and then take them to sell. So they're not going to spend their time collecting things that will earn them less money when they only have so many hours in a day. So, and there's a good kind of breakdown of that also in the Stemming Tide report.
Oh, we have a question in the back.
One of the challenges right now with recycling plastics is that virgin plastic's often cheaper than going through the process of collecting it and paying for the collection. do you have any idea about the demand in terms of people who are willing to pay more to take recycled plastic, to repurpose it, to reuse it for clothes or sunglasses or carpets or whatever else?
Yeah, so you're right. That is also a challenge. And beyond it just being cheaper, it was actually more of a challenge with the fact that virgin materials, virgin plastics in particular, benefit from a lot of systemic advantages over secondary materials. You know, if you want to source secondary plastic or recycled plastic, it's much more difficult. The supply is not as steady. The price might not be as steady. It's harder to find one supplier that can sell you all of it that you need. The volume is not always available. So even beyond that, there's more. But there is still demand, a lot of demand for recycled materials. And that's a lot actually driven by their customers, right? People want recycled materials in their stuff. They want to buy the recycled, plastic water bottle and things like that. So there is willingness. I mean, obviously you won't get everyone demanding it, and I don't have any numbers, but I do know that from the work that what we work with companies is that they are looking for more. So.
Okay, one more.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier there was a connection between the public health and the waste management cycle. Can you talk a little bit more about that connection and what helps drive that as an economic driver in these countries?
Sure, yeah. So when you're talking about waste that's not collected or open dump sites, there are a lot of public health, ways that it affects public health. So one is that as waste breaks down, and in most of these places, most of the waste in there is not plastic. It's food and organic material. And as that breaks down, it creates what's called leachate, which is an inspiring word in itself. And that is kind of like the goop that comes off of these materials. And it can do things like seep into the ground, get into the groundwater sources, contaminate that. Then you have people getting ill from drinking the groundwater. I just read an article that there was a disaster in Sri Lanka where a dump site actually collapsed and moved into a neighborhood. And they had been complaining for months that leachate was actually flooding their streets in this neighborhood that was near the dump site. And what can happen then is not only are you physically in contact with, bacteria, other contaminants, but it also is a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and you can have more malaria cases. And then there's the open fires that break out in these dumps, and that causes air pollution, bad air quality. People have more respiratory diseases. So those are the connections. As far as how that drives the desire for better waste management, I think that's something that we need to push more and show more this improvement that can be made. I mean, those two case studies in the Caribbean, I apologize, I don't remember which countries it was off the top of my head, but I can find it. They saved up to 25% of their public health, their healthcare costs after 1 year after implementing it. I mean, that's something we should talk about a lot more. Yeah. All right, thank you.